stainless steel DeLorean.
In the late 1970s and early 80s, the DeLorean DMC-12 became the most talked about automobile in the world. It would briefly bring glamour to the city of Belfast, which at the time was being torn apart by a seemingly never-ending cycle of violence. But the project would soon collapse into a shambles of incompetence, deceit, and fraud. John DeLorean, the man behind the fiasco, could charitably be described as an irresponsible and egotistical dreamer. Most people described him as a crook. DeLorean was originally a car designer of some renown. His most famous creation was the Pontiac GTO, considered a generational car in the 1960s. It was said that success went to DeLorean's head, that he became arrogant and lazy, and was more interested in high living than producing great cars. It was also alleged that he stole other people's inventions and passed them off as his own. According to DeLorean, he had resigned from General Motors to follow his dream of making, quote, ethical cars. In truth, General Motors fired him. Fast forward to August 1978 and a packed press conference in Belfast, Northern Ireland. DeLorean sat with the British government's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Roy Mason, to announce a deal had been signed to produce the so-called Dream Car in Civil War-torn Belfast. The government were desperate for prosperity to counter violence, and DeLorean knew it. The glitzy American bragged about how the whole world had competed to host his car plant. Parts of it were true, but some governments had done due diligence on his plans and concluded that they were a recipe for disaster. The British had stumped up an initial £54 million, with another $10 million on hand, together with a host of tax and grant sweeteners. 2 years later, a gleaming new factory had been built in one of Belfast's most deprived and contentious areas that would eventually employ 2,000 people. Yet the carefully constructed myths around the man and his car had already begun to fall apart. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. The original car design had indeed been revolutionary, and that was what had sold the British government on it. But the car that went into production was quite different. The differences were camouflaged by media bluff and bluster. Tales of 30,000 pre-orders for the car were just that. Initial reviews from the motoring media were at best lukewarm. The car was considered underpowered for its class. Components were standard. The gull-wing doors and aluminium structure were captivating, but it was all style over substance. Rumours abounded of shoddy construction. DeLorean blamed the US recession for poor sales. However, the Corvette, which the DeLorean was supposed to blow out of the water, was selling like hotcakes at the time. As the cars piled up in dealerships and docksides, so did the financial losses. Of the 8,900 cars produced, fewer than half sold. Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives had replaced the Labour government in 1979. She despised DeLorean and his project, but had inherited a £64 million fait accompli. The IRA prisoners' hunger strike of 1981 had turned Northern Ireland into a tinderbox. Pulling the plug on DeLorean was seen as putting a match to the tinder. DeLorean had Thatcher over a barrel and gleefully extracted another £20 million that everyone knew was going to a company that was doomed. The factory went into receivership in February 1982. Then in October 1982, the British government seized the factory and placed it into liquidation, following a bombshell no one saw coming. DeLorean had been arrested in a Los Angeles airport hotel and charged by the FBI with taking part in a plot to smuggle 100 kilograms of cocaine. The drugs had a street value of $50 million. U.S. Justice Department officials claimed that DeLorean was making a last-minute effort to raise the money needed to save his bankrupt car company in Northern Ireland. DeLorean would later be acquitted of the charges, probably rightly so, since rules against entrapment appeared to have been violated. But if nothing else, it gave an insight into his character, or lack of it. Further insights came when the government attempted to unravel the liquidated factory. DeLorean had contracted Colin Chapman, of Lotus fame, to finish the design and engineering in 2 years. Most car makers set aside 6. When Chapman balked, DeLorean bribed him, offering to split the £16.5 million of private investors' money between the two of them. DeLorean channeled his half through offshore accounts. Chapman died before he could be called to account for what happened to his half. Taxpayers' money was also swindled in the same web of complex transfers that would eventually end up in DeLorean's private interests. On September the 21st, 1985, DeLorean was indicted on charges that he defrauded investors and committed tax evasion by diverting millions of dollars raised for the company to himself. He was acquitted of all charges. Jurors had apparently misunderstood the judge's instructions and failed to declare a hung jury. DeLorean, by now claiming to be a born-again Christian, played the role of the persecuted saint as he walked free. He spent the rest of his life in relative anonymity and luxury, never suffering any legal or financial penalty for his wrongdoings. It seems clear that if you embarrass the right people thoroughly enough, they will be prepared to make just about anything go away. His legacy in the US seems unencumbered by memories of his wrongdoing. The same can't be said in the UK. As for the car, it still retains a dedicated following, boosted by the Back to the Future movies and other occasional Hollywood appearances. A wealth of spare parts were originally available, although these are dwindling over time. Still admired for its audacious design, it will always be an enduring curiosity. It is perhaps unfortunate that it will also always bear the name of the corrupt and shady character who brought it to life.
Live the dream today.
George Blake, who died on the 26th of December, aged 98, was a spy for Britain's MI6, who famously betrayed his country and worked as a double agent for the Soviet Union. The story of his life, career, and escape to the Soviet Union was every bit as remarkable as any spy novel. Blake was born as George Behar in Rotterdam on the 11th of November 1922. His father was an Egyptian Sephardic Jew and his mother was Dutch. His comfortable existence in the Netherlands was interrupted by his father's death in 1936, whereupon he was sent to live with a wealthy aunt in Cairo. There, he became close to one of his cousins, a committed communist, who, Blake remembered, had a great influence on him. By the time World War II broke out, he had returned to the Netherlands. Blake possessed British citizenship via his father's service in the British Army, and was therefore interned by the Nazis, though he managed to conceal his Jewish heritage. The occupiers released him since he was under 18, but he joined the Dutch resistance as a courier. In 1942, he escaped from the Netherlands and travelled to Britain via Spain and Gibraltar, reaching London in January 1943. By this time, the family had officially changed their surname to Blake. Blake joined the Royal Navy as a sub-lieutenant before being recruited by the Secret Intelligence Service, a forerunner of MI6, in 1944. In 1946, he was posted to Hamburg and put in charge of the interrogation of German U-boat captains. In 1947, the Navy sent Blake to study languages, including Russian, at Downing College, Cambridge. He was then posted to the British legation in Seoul, South Korea. Under cover as a vice consul, Blake's mission was to gather intelligence on Communist North Korea, Communist China, and the Soviet Far East. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 was the turning point in Blake's life. Seoul was captured by the advancing North Korean forces. Blake and the other British diplomats were taken prisoner. As the tide of the war turned, Blake and the others were taken north to Pyongyang. After seeing the bombing of North Korea and reading the works of Karl Marx and others during his 3-year detention, he became a communist. Blake arranged a secret meeting with his captors and volunteered to work for the Soviet spy service, the MGB. When asked if there was any one thing that prompted his turning to communists, he said, "It was the relentless bombing of small Korean villages by enormous American flying fortresses. Women and children and old people, because the young men were in the army. We might have been victims ourselves. It made me feel ashamed of belonging to these overpowering, technically superior countries, fighting against what seemed to me defenseless people. I felt I was on the wrong side, that it would be better for humanity if the communist system prevailed, that it would put an end to war." Released in 1953, he returned to the UK with the rest of the detainees and was greeted as a hero. He married in 1954. Then in 1955, he was sent by MI6 to work as a case officer in Berlin, where his task was to recruit Soviet officers as double agents. Instead, he informed his KGB contacts of the details of British and American operations, including Operation Gold, in which a tunnel into East Berlin was used to tap telephone lines used by the Soviet military. Soviet capture of the tunnel did not occur until a year later, so as to protect Blake. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. In the following 9-year period, Blake is thought to have betrayed up to 40 MI6 agents, all but destroying the organization's operations in Eastern Europe. Blake later said, "I don't know what I handed over because it was so much." In 1959, Blake became aware of a CIA mole inside the GRU and played a part in exposing Peter Popoff, who was executed in 1960. By 1961, Blake had fallen under suspicion after allegations by a number of defectors. Summoned from Lebanon, where he had been enrolled at the Middle East Center for Arabic Studies, he was arrested and interrogated. 3 days in, he slipped up and admitted working for the other side. He then gave a full confession. The maximum term for Blake's offences was 14 years, but prosecutors divided his crimes into 3 separate counts. His trial was held in secret at the Old Bailey. He was found guilty and sentenced to 42 years, the longest sentence, excluding life terms, ever handed down by a British court. Blake was regarded as a model prisoner in Wormwood Scrubs, but all the time he was secretly planning an escape, with the help of 3 men he had met in jail. Sean Burke, a petty criminal from Limerick in Ireland, and 2 anti-nuclear campaigners, Michael Randall and Pat Pottle. The escape was masterminded by Burke, with financial and logistical support from the others. The 3 had struck up a friendship with Blake while in prison, and believed the lengthy sentence he received was unjust. It was later revealed that film director Tony Richardson, who won an Academy Award in 1964 for Best Director for the film Tom Jones, contributed financially to the plot. The conspirators were in contact via a walkie-talkie that had been smuggled into the prison. On the 22nd of October 1966, while most of the other inmates and guards were at the weekly film showing, Blake broke a cell block window and climbed through it. Sliding down a porch, he ran to the perimeter wall, where Burke had thrown a rope ladder over it. Scaling a wall, the prisoner was driven away to a safe house. The plan worked like a charm. Blake then spent several days moving between Randall and Pottle's friends' houses, including that of Reverend John Papworth in Earl's Court. After waiting until the heat had died down, they smuggled Blake across the channel in a camper van, driving through northern Europe and crossing into East Germany without incident. From there, the KGB took him to Moscow. Randall and Pottle were not prosecuted until 1991, when they were acquitted by a jury. Burke was never brought before a court. At the time, the Republic of Ireland had no extradition for so-called political offences. Divorced in absentia by his wife in 1966, Blake married again in the Soviet Union. In 1990, he attempted to write an autobiography, but an advance in royalties were seized by the British government. In various interviews, he remained committed to Marxism-Leninism. He also denied being a traitor, stating in 2012, "To betray, first you have to belong. I never belonged." When he died on the 26th of December 2020, tributes included words like legendary. Vladimir Putin, an ex-KGB agent himself, sent his deep condolences to Blake's family. He said, "Colonel Blake was a brilliant professional of special vitality and courage." With his passing, there is now almost no one of significance left who fought the Cold War. But as tensions have risen between West and East again, it may not be too long before a new generation will be fighting Cold War too, if they aren't already. The General Belgrano was an Argentine Navy light cruiser that was sunk by a British nuclear submarine during the Falklands War of 1982 between Britain and Argentina. The sinking, which accounted for just over half of the Argentine casualties during the conflict, became a lightning rod for controversy. It was established that the ship had been sunk outside the British naval exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, and critics claimed that it was therefore an illegal act. She remains the only ship to have been sunk during military operations by a nuclear-powered submarine, and the second sunk in action by any type of submarine since World War II. The Belgrano began as the USS Phoenix, built in Camden, New Jersey, and launched in 1938. Surviving the attack on Pearl Harbor, she won 9 battle stars for service in World War II. Decommissioned in 1946, the ship was bought by Argentina in 1951. Originally named 17 de October, a date of significance for Argentine President Juan Perón's party, the ship took part in the military coup that overthrew Perón in 1955. It was then renamed after General Belgrano, a renowned fighter for Argentine independence in the early 1800s. On the 2nd of April 1982, a struggling and unpopular Argentine military junta invaded the Falkland Islands, a British dependency long claimed by Argentina, approximately 300 miles from the Argentine mainland. The invasion was received rapturously in Buenos Aires, and the junta assumed that Britain would not bother fighting over islands that were 8,000 miles away. Instead, Britain declared a maritime exclusion zone of 200 nautical miles around the Falkland Islands, within which any Argentine warship or naval auxiliary entering might be attacked by British nuclear-powered submarines. On the 30th of April, this was upgraded to a total exclusion zone, within which any sea vessel or aircraft from any country entering the zone might be fired upon without further warning. This was justified by the British under Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defence. Its legal status was unprecedented and debatable, but it was respected by states not involved in the conflict. As it became clear that British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was sending a task force to retake the islands, General Galtieri, leader of the Argentine junta, moved to reinforce their grip. Naval forces, including the Belgrano, took up positions around the islands. By the 29th of April, the ships were patrolling the Birdwood Bank, south of the Falklands. On the 30th of April, General Belgrano was detected by the British nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarine Conqueror. The submarine approached over the following day. On the 1st of May 1982, Admiral Juan Lombardo ordered all Argentine naval units to seek out the British task force around the Falklands and launch a, quote, massive attack the following day. General Belgrano, which was outside and to the southwest of the exclusion zone, was ordered southeast. Lombardo's signal was intercepted by British intelligence. Thatcher and her war cabinet, meeting at Chequers the following day, agreed to a request from Admiral Terence Lewin, the Chief of Defence Staff, to alter the rules of engagement and allow an attack on General Belgrano outside the exclusion zone. The British decided that the Argentine ships were a threat. After consultation at cabinet level, Thatcher ordered Conqueror to attack General Belgrano. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. 3 torpedoes were fired at 15:57 local time. 2 struck the ship on areas unprotected by armor plating, causing catastrophic damage. The explosion aft killed up to 275 men, striking a mess and relaxation area. The ship filled with smoke and lost electrical power, so no distress signal could be sent. The ship began to list to port and to sink towards the bow. 20 minutes after the attack, at 16:24, Captain Bonzo ordered the crew to abandon ship. Inflatable life rafts were deployed, and the evacuation began without panic. 2 escort ships with the Belgrano were unaware of the attack due to poor weather conditions and visibility, though the crew of Bouchard felt an impact from the 3rd torpedo that missed the Belgrano. By the time they realized something was wrong, it was dark, and the life rafts were scattered. Argentine and Chilean ships rescued 772 men in all from the 3rd to the 5th of May. In total, 323 were killed in the attack, 321 members of the crew, and 2 civilians who were on board at the time. The loss of the Belgrano was a crushing blow. The Argentine Navy had little choice but to return to base. They were at the mercy of the British submarines. The British now had sea supremacy, and Argentine jets were forced to operate from the limits of their range, with aircraft carriers returned to the mainland. The sinking was immediately controversial. The junta denounced it as a treacherous act of armed aggression. British opponents of Thatcher in the war, of which there were many, echoed this criticism. In May 1983, Thatcher received a rough ride on a TV debate programme, which appeared to be a coordinated ambush on her by the BBC. A 1985 leak of secret documents by a civil servant to Labour MP Tam Dalyell confirmed that the Belgrano was sailing away from the islands when struck. Whilst this appeared to vindicate the critics, it wasn't as simple as that. A message passed via the Swiss embassy in Buenos Aires to the Argentine government 9 days before the sinking made clear that the UK no longer considered the 200-mile exclusion zone as the limit of its military action. Argentine Rear Admiral Alara, who was in charge of the task force of which General Belgrano was part, said, "After that message of 23rd of April, the entire South Atlantic was an operational theatre for both sides. We as professionals said it was just too bad that we lost the Belgrano." In August 1994, an official Argentine Defense Ministry report, written by Armed Forces Auditor Eugenio Miari, was released, which described the sinking of General Belgrano as, quote, "a legal act of war." In 2003, the captain of the Belgrano, Hector Bonzo, confirmed that General Belgrano had actually been manoeuvring or zigzagging and not sailing away from the exclusion zone. Bonzo stated that any suggestion that HMS Conqueror's actions were a betrayal was wrong, and that the submarine carried out its duties according to the accepted rules of war. Bonzo added that he was not angry about the attack on the ship and that the limit did not exclude danger or risks. It was all the same in or out. I would like to be quite precise that, as far as I was concerned, the 200-mile limit was valid until the 1st of May, that is, while diplomatic negotiations were taking place, and or until a real act of war took place, and that had happened on the 1st of May. Many Argentine veterans described the sinking as a war crime and brought an unsuccessful legal action against the British government. And in 2012, Argentine President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner also referred to the sinking of the General Belgrano as a war crime. However, it is, and remains, the official position of the Argentine Navy that the sinking of the Belgrano was a legal act of war, and that the ship was proceeding to attack the British task force. Margaret Thatcher was never a unifying figure, and it is easy to jump to the conclusion that there was something nefarious about the sinking of the Belgrano. Setting aside her, and the conflict itself, it is perhaps far more instructive to listen to the losing side. In the end, the sinking was yet another tragic loss of life in war, of which there have been far too many in our lifetimes. Jill Dando was a much admired and popular television presenter for the BBC, who was murdered on her front doorstep on the 26th of April, 1999. It was a crime that was as baffling as it was shocking. One man would spend 8 years in jail for the murder, only to be acquitted. The case remains unsolved to this day. After an early stint in local broadcasting, Dando began a national career as a newsreader. She then moved on to present the holiday programme, as well as the ratings-winning Crime Watch UK. At the time of her death, she was firmly established as a viewer's favourite. On the morning of her murder, Dando had returned from her fiancé's home to her own home, which she no longer frequented, and was in the process of selling. As she opened her front door, she was grabbed from behind, forced downwards, and shot in the head with a 9mm automatic. Death was instantaneous. A neighbour, Helen Doble, found her approximately 15 minutes later. Richard Hughes, her next-door neighbour, had heard a surprised cry from Dando, quote, like someone greeting a friend, but heard no gunshot. Hughes looked out of his front window, and while not realizing what had happened, made the only certain sighting of the killer, a 6-foot-tall white man, aged around 40, walking away from Dando's house. The Metropolitan Police formed Operation Oxborough with a huge investigative team, as one would expect, given the high profile and intense publicity surrounding the crime. They talked to over 2,500 people and took more than 1,000 statements. Many theories circulated on the murder. An obsessed fan or jilted ex sprang immediately to mind. Police also examined the possibility of a professional hit, either by a criminal who had been brought to book as a result of Crime Watch UK, or elements involved in conflicts in the Balkans. Jill Dando had fronted news bulletins in the period that included crises in that region, and may have become associated with NATO action against Serbia in the minds of Serbian nationalists. It was even suggested that a professional rival, jealous of her status and popularity, had hired a hitman. A later and more outlandish theory was that Dando had been investigating the now-known paedophile activities that were going on at the BBC, principally involving Jimmy Savile, and was silenced because of what she had learned. After a year of investigation, detectives had drawn a blank. Various men who resembled the description of the killer had been seen close to the house on the day, or in the days leading up to the killing. More sightings were reported of men running in streets near the scene. Despite public appeals, reconstructions on Crime Watch, and massive media coverage, the investigation was going nowhere. DCI Hamish Campbell, leading the investigation, appeared again on Crime Watch 1 year on. His remarks would be retrospectively criticised. The contract assassination theory had now been dropped. The Met were now focusing exclusively on the lone killer theory. Campbell described the suspect thus: "Link the loner, the obsession with firearms, the ability to be in that street at that time on that Monday, and the description. Even if it's not an obsession with Jill Dando, it's an obsession with other women, or an obsession with something else. That's where we're talking about the obsession with guns. A previous gun club member. An interest in guns with specialist books and magazines." As it turned out, the man that Campbell was describing sounded exactly like Barry George. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. George, who lived about half a mile from Dando's house, had a history of stalking women, sexual offences, and other antisocial and attention-seeking behaviour, including claiming to be related to Freddie Mercury. He was also a gun nut and former gun club member. George was already under surveillance. He was arrested on the 25th of May 2000 and charged with Dando's murder on the 28th of May. Though the whole community wanted justice for Jill Dando, there was deep concern that the case against George was thin gruel. He had little apparent interest in the presenter. Identification evidence was weak. He also appeared to have an alibi. Mental illness and epilepsy made it difficult to believe that he could have the wherewithal to execute such a professional and meticulously planned killing. The case hinged on some disputed forensic evidence, a tiny speck of supposed gunshot residue found on George's coat a year after the crime. Nevertheless, George was convicted of murder on the 2nd of July 2001 and sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 subsequent appeals failed. In 2007, after a BBC Panorama programme demolished the scientific evidence against him. The Court of Appeal quashed his conviction and ordered a retrial. This time, George was acquitted. He received substantial damages from national newspapers, who had claimed he was guilty, and also printed stories suggesting he had resumed stalking women. However, he was denied compensation by the government for the 8 years he had spent in prison. Campbell and the Metropolitan Police came under heavy fire after the verdict. It was alleged that, under pressure, and with no prospect of solving the case, they had simply decided to fit up the local oddball. Campbell's comments on the Crime Watch appeal seemed to suggest that he already had George in the frame, and was inviting viewers to fit the evidence around him. In an interview with the Evening Standard in 2013, on the occasion of his retirement, Campbell said he had no regrets. He added, "We, the Met Police, did everything we could to understand that murder and bring the person responsible to court, and we did that, twice." Cold case reviews by the police after 2008 have concluded that Dando was killed by a professional assassin in a so-called hard contact execution. Pressing the gun against her head would have acted as a suppressor, muffling the sound of the shot and preventing the killer from being splattered with blood. More than 20 years on, there are still no answers. The loss of such a talented and popular person in such a senseless manner is still felt by many. Hopefully justice will eventually be done, though as the years go by, those hopes seem more and more unlikely to come to pass.